matters? Of course it does. Welcome once again. I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This long-running program continues to provide legal information, relevant examples, and practical assistance to help you with law matters because the law matters. A better understanding of the law makes you better prepared to protect yourself, your family, and your business. As we present various topics, you may decide, as we suggest, that you may be able to handle some issues yourself. If you decide to enlist professional counsel, you'll be better prepared, as will the professional you select. As we always say, our goal is to help you save time, money, and achieve the best possible results. Also, once again, we want to welcome and thank Attorney David Bizarre from the Bizarre and Associates
Thank you.
law firm in East Providence, who continues to help us with legal information and his insights in each session. So today, starting a business, entrepreneurship. These days, it's WFH, working from home. Sometimes it's as an employee, but sometimes it's the startup of a new business as well. Sometimes it's called solopreneurship. So what do you need to know from a legal perspective if you're thinking about even working in the gig economy, or if you're thinking about starting a full-blown business? What questions should you ask yourself, and what questions specifically today should you ask a lawyer? We actually have 7 that have become very popular and have been really very interesting of late. So we'll get into that in a few minutes. Before we do, a few interesting factoids, such as right now, over 69% of startup companies started as home businesses. Only 40% of those startups are able to become profitable, and 58% of those startups have less than $25,000 at their disposal during the startup phase, which is interesting. So, David, when people start to think about making it official and they're starting a business, most seem to ask, what business structure should I choose? I don't know if that's always the first question, because they may just hit the ground and running. What do you think about what business structure people should consider, and when does it matter?
So early on, it matters because of liability, and that's what most people are concerned about. How do I protect myself from liability? And that structure can take many different forms. So my question will always be, where do you see the business going? Do you see the business having partners in the future if it's a solo proprietor who's come in? Do you see needing to raise money? And how do you intend to raise money as you go forward? Those are the types of issues that will really drive what type of structure you should use, because if it's a business that you're starting that is going to be hopefully a very large company with a lot of employees and require a lot of capitalization to get going, then you're going to want to have a type of company where you can sell stock or raise money in that type of form. And that's really the old traditional stock corporation or company that has the INC at the end of it, and you have authorization for a certain number of shares of stock. So what corporate structure generally is, from a legal perspective, is a controlling of how the business is going to be run, who's in charge of the business, who has the say and control over how the business is run, and how is money raised for the business, what's the capitalization or the ownership. And if you think about the New York Stock Exchange, for example, large public corporations that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ or whatever, really sort of are a good way to study and understand what corporations do, because the stock that's sold on the exchange is the stock certificates that represent the ownership of the business. So the people who are stockholders, what rights do they have? Well, they get to elect the directors. And then the directors control who they hire to run the company, the CEO and the other people that work for the board of directors of a corporation. So it's stock ownership of the business, which is used to raise money so that the business has money, capital to run. The management of the business, the directors, and the managers of the business that the directors hire. So that's something to think about as far as corporate structure goes.
And for those who are just starting out and aren't even thinking yet about the fact that they may need to raise lots of money, maybe they need to ask their cousin, Louis, for a loan, and they need to have a business plan and all the rest of it. But for a sole proprietorship, which is what most startups look to, how would you address the fact that someone may come to you and say, David, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do yet, but I don't know, do I really need to incorporate a business? Do I need an LLC? I'm really just worried about my personal risk if someone sues me or if something goes wrong with what they made or sold. And there's the issue about separating the business from yourself personally. So at what point, even if they're not quite ready to raise funds, at what point do you say they need to be concerned about that degree of separation?
So I would start out with, what is the business plan? What is it that you're going to do? Are you starting out with, I am selling a service, which is really just you, and I'm not manufacturing anything, I'm not importing anything, I don't need a sales force, I'm just doing what I do myself. That, to me, just right there, I could say, yeah, an LLC. That's all you really need. Because
why an LLC?
Limited liability company. It gives you protection. I would always tell anyone who is in a service type of industry or business, you want that structure for some liability protection, but you also want to have insurance. You should always have enough insurance to cover you if you make a mistake or something happens and there's a possibility that you might be sued. So that type of structure that you're telling me, I'm in a service industry, or how about I'm opening up a convenience store and it's just me. I need to buy merchandise to sell, and I need to hire some employees to take care of the cash register and the inventory and that type of thing. Again, an LLC would probably work in that structure because you don't have a lot of need probably to raise money through the sale of stock. If you need money to borrow to buy inventory, you're probably just going to do that with a line of credit or a business loan of some type. So the LLC can do that. And if you're new, even though it's an LLC and you would like the LLC to be responsible for the debt that the corporation or company is taking on, the bank or whoever's loaning the money is probably going to have you sign personally as a guarantor anyway. So you're not going to get that much protection against owing the money that the corporation borrows. But if you're buying inventory from somebody through the LLC without a personal guarantee, then the company's liable, and so there's some protection for the debt of the company in that sense. But usually an LLC, because it's easier and more flexible to put together.
So while we're still on that structure, sole proprietorship, we mentioned a little bit about LLC, a little bit about corporations and raising stock. How about the idea of actual costs and how each is structured in terms of how the person is taxed? Okay. Taxed personally versus the pass-through that LLC and corps don't. Would you address that?
Yeah. When you start an LLC, they'll ask you in the articles of organization, is it just you, a sole proprietorship? So you would maybe check off disregard the entity as a separate entity for tax purposes, because it's just going to pass through to you for everything. If it's a sort of like a partnership type of situation where you're going to share based on your ownership of the LLC, of the membership interest, you could check it off so it can pass through to you in that sense, or have it taxed as a separate company. That really is an accounting question, depending on what you're doing and what write-offs and benefits you can get by having an LLC pass through the taxes directly to you. And usually at the beginning, probably the losses, so there might be some deductions, so it's not a bad thing. With a corporation, there are actually two choices that you can make, probably more, but to simplify it, you can have the corporation taxed as a regular C corporation, where the corporation files its own tax return that pays its own taxes based on any profit or retained earnings that it might keep in the corporate coffers. So we sometimes think about those corporations as having a double taxation, and it is in this sense. The corporation pays tax on whatever the income the corporation makes. And remember, that was part of the big tax reform that they said they reduced the corporate tax rate. Really, it affects big corporations, but it also will affect smaller corporations. And this is what the tax rate is for a corporation, and whatever profits it makes, it's paid at that rate. Now you want to take money out of the corporation because you're a stockholder, the company's done well, and it has retained earnings or money that can be paid out. So that gets paid to you in the form of a dividend. When it gets paid to you in the form of a dividend, you pay tax on the dividend. That's why the owners of a corporation sometimes think they're paying double taxation because the corporation's paid tax and now they're paying tax. A corporation can be structured as a sub-S corporation where the taxes are passed through directly, like the LLC was, to the stockholders, and they get a K-1 or some other form from their accountant from the corporation after it files saying, this was the profit or loss and I'm taking it on my own personal tax return.
And with the S corporation, how is the dividend paid? How is that working? And also in terms of the corporation's cost, S corp versus C corp versus LLCs.
So the first question about how does the profit pass through on an S versus a C, it passes through directly to your tax return. So you can take the money out, leave the money in. That's up to you to decide what you want to do. Usually, again, in consultation with your accountant, what you need for reserves and capital and all of that. But it is treated very much the way an LLC where pass through to the owners is done. The cost can be pretty similar, actually, to start each of them. With the LLC, if there's more than one partner, you want an operating agreement. That's going to drive the cost up from a legal perspective a little bit because you want to spell out all of the same things you would spell out in a corporation, which requires bylaws and stock certificates and articles of organization and corporation that lay out like a buy-sell agreement in similar to operating agreement in an LLC. What's going to happen if one of the partners leaves the corporation? In a corporation, can they just sell it to someone else, or is there a right of first refusal, or you have to sell it to your partner? And can your partner set the price, or how do you set the price for what it's going to be? If someone dies, how is that taken care of? So these are sort of complicated agreements that can be done both in an operating agreement in an LLC and a buy-sell agreement in a corporation structure that if you have more than one person, you really want to have in place.
And for example, how about when someone says, well, we'll just keep it a loose partnership? And what do you say as a lawyer when you know that perhaps the two individuals, if it's a partnership, making choices and one makes an inadvertently very bad choice? For example, a landscaper decides it'd be just a terrific idea to import poppy and then finds that there's a problem with that, and he's sued, and his partner says, gee, why should I have been exposed at that kind of punishment level of $50,000 or some exorbitant amount of money? So what kind of protections are there in place, or can you put in place to prevent that kind of risk?
So with an LLC and a corporation, there is some protection for the members or the stockholders. With a partnership, you can be liable for whatever it is your partner does. And so you've got to be very cautious with who your partner is and what kind of agreement you have in the partnership. And it's difficult sometimes to limit your liability. You can have a limited liability partnership, so to speak, that can help with that. But it's much more difficult in a general partnership to limit liability, especially to a third party. So within the articles and agreements that you can put into an LLC and a corporation, you can have some of those things written out as to who's responsible for management, who's responsible for those kinds of decisions, and what liability will I have as a member or a stockholder. Those are the types of structure you would want when you really need to limit yourself against liability for something someone else does. Although the corporation will still be liable directly, but that's the shield that it places between the owner and the public.
And this is why we spend the time discussing this, because many don't really have the background about this and haven't considered these things. If we back up just for a second, but not completely, when people start a business, they can't wait to rush to have a sign painted or printed or their business cards printed. Before they do, what do you need to know about choosing a name when you're starting a business, David?
So if you're starting a business with a registration with the state or Commonwealth, where you're going to say, this is the name I want to use, you have to go on their database and check to see if the name's available, because you can't use the name that somebody else has already used. In fact, it can't even really be that similar. So if you want to sell water and you want the name Coca-Cola, you're probably not going to be able to use that name. But it's something that a lawyer would do as a matter of course. If you came to him and said, well, this is what I'm thinking, we can look it up and say, yeah, that name's not available. If it's a similar name to something else, you could seek permission from the other group to use the name. If you're doing something totally different, it may be possible if it's not too close to another name. But you have to check the availability of the name before you choose the name.
Good advice. And this more recently has come up as a part of a set of questions that new businesses are considering. We've talked about this topic before regarding risks, and you've mentioned accountants, and we've spoken a bit about insurance, and yet now, if someone comes to you as a lawyer and says, how do I minimize my risks as now what might be me as an employer? Questions coming up such as anti-discrimination, health and safety regulations, wage and hour laws, immigration issues, and heretofore those weren't topping the list of critical questions to ask anyone, much less a lawyer. What do you say to that, David?
Well, one you didn't mention, which would have been the first one, usually, workers' compensation
insurance. How about
insurance.
workers' comp? That too.
And do I have to have it? And if you have an employee, you have to have it.
Versus just freelancers. I was going to get to that in the gig portion of it, but that's true too. So.
Yeah, so just to touch base a little bit on the workers' comp, if you have employees as opposed to contractors or freelancers that you don't pay, they're 1099, then you have to have workers' compensation insurance. You have to follow all of the laws on what you pay somebody, minimum wage and work hours and that type of thing. So yes, those things are all things that as an employer you need to consider and understand and be able to follow.
What about anti-discrimination? We understand why that might be a question that's asked now in view of what's been headlining the news for countless months or whatever. What do you say to someone about how they prevent an attack or minimize their risk about anti-discrimination? What do they do?
Are you asking that in terms of their business practices or in terms of who they hire?
Both.
So you are, in Rhode Island for sure, an at-will usually employer. You don't have a union. There's no contracts or anything with who you're hiring. You cannot discriminate in your hiring practices, but you are allowed to hire the person or people you want to hire. So usually the issue with discrimination for a company comes up not usually in the hiring process unless you're doing something overtly wrong, but when you're letting somebody go. And oftentimes it's an age discrimination. Oh, well, this company's now 20 years old and they're letting the highest paid, oldest person go because they're old. Or some other form of discrimination, which we know you can't do. So my advice on that is understand what the rules are and the laws are and follow those. And if you need to speak to a labor lawyer or an attorney about it before getting involved in that, do that.
And what about facing immigration issues? There's been discussion, debate about E-Verify. Go through that a little bit if you would.
Yeah, so that a while back was a really big deal about were we going to require people to use E-Verify and make sure that the person they were hiring was allowed to work in the United States, that they had all the proper documentation and all of that type of thing. So you should, obviously someone who comes to work for you has to have a Social Security number because you have to put them in your payroll system so that you can pay them. And you do have a requirement to at least ask for, well, let me give you an example. When I worked for a college as an adjunct professor, they made me bring information to show my Social Security number and all of that. That's what they required. Do you have to ask to see someone's Social Security card? I don't think you need to do that, but you have to get a number and you have to at least satisfy yourself that the person you're hiring is allowed to work in the United States.
And some, when someone is applying for a job, I'll get it to you, David, next week. And a week to, and I guess some employers have arbitrarily said, but after a month, if I haven't been able to get that number, sometimes they pull the trigger even before that. If I haven't been able to get that number, you're not satisfying some minimum level requirement that I have to pursue this and keep you on my payroll, when in fact, maybe that's not legitimate and there would be an issue.
You're putting yourself at risk if you can't verify that somebody has a Social Security number that you can put into your payroll and whatever other benefits that they might be entitled to. So it's not unreasonable at that point to say, if you can't verify this, then I can't keep you as an employee because I'll be at risk.
Got it.
But it's, again, do you have to use that e-verify system anymore? I don't believe that is the case.
Right, that's my understanding too. So thanks for clarifying that. Small businesses need some licenses, permits, contracts. While we always talk about, we try to help people with do-it-yourself, this maybe some of these things they can do themselves, like what does your town need for a permit? But let's go through some of the required legal documents such as these that they need.
Yeah, so you're starting a new business and you're going to have a storefront and you're selling things at retail. So you may need a permit from the city or town to do that. You probably need a license for whatever it is you're selling or doing. And you definitely need, if you're selling at retail, a tax resale certificate to collect the sales tax and be registered to collect the sales tax and remit that to the state. So those are things that you can probably do on your own, but an attorney can certainly help you with. There's just brought me to in mind of another issue is, if you're renting, do you need a lease, and or are you going to be month to month, and what risks do you have if you're month to month versus having a lease? So if you're month to month, the landlord could evict you even if you're paying your rent, just because they want to terminate the lease and bring someone else, not the lease, but the month to month tenancy, and bring someone else in at a higher rate. So you probably would want a longer term lease to have your rent set in stone and have that time frame that you're going to be there for the investment that you're putting into starting that business. But do you want it to be a 5-year lease or a 10-year lease or a 20-year lease, or would you rather have a shorter term lease with an option to renew that you control the option to renew at so that there's less risk? If there's no personal guarantee and it's through your corporation and the corporation's at risk, that's one of those things that you'd really love to have the LLC or the corporation sign for, not you personally, so that you're not at risk if it doesn't make it and the landlord can't come back to you and say, you owe me that rent.
Important tip. So do you think that the average person is able to enter into that contract, be able to vet it themselves safely without getting into trouble, or is that really clearly in your mind something that you should have an attorney's set of eyes on?
When you're getting into the realm of a commercial lease, you really should have an attorney look at it, because there are going to be things in there that you won't even think of and don't even necessarily know what the impact is on you. For example, you started a business and you're doing really well and it's a storefront and you now want to sell it. What does the lease say about assigning or subleasing in the lease? Does it allow you to assign the lease to someone else who might buy the store from you? There's language that needs to be in there that says that the landlord can't unreasonably withhold consent for you to assign the lease to the new buyer so that you have an asset to sell. So these are some things in the lease that you really need to be careful of, and who's responsible for the HVAC maintenance, the storefront maintenance, the snow removal, the repairs that need to be made, those types of things. That needs to be looked at and determined as to what's reasonable and not reasonable.
Good to know. And while we're talking about contracts and things, what would you say to the prospective business owner, startup, what contracts does my business need? And in some cases, maybe it's how you handle disputes or non-compete. What kind of contracts would you
depending on what you're doing.
Certainly.
So if you have someone coming in to be trained on your equipment, do you want some kind of a release that they sign that you're not liable if they misuse the equipment and get hurt or that type of thing? Do you want, if you're selling, back to the convenience store, selling things, do you want a contract with your supplier that says, these are the amounts that I'm going to buy and that you're going to supply, and that these are going to be the cost of these rates, if you can lock those things in. So there are a number of different types of either releases or membership contracts. If it's, you've opened up a little yoga classroom or gym or something, any type of contract or lease or supply agreement or any of that type of thing, I'd want to have an attorney review those to make sure there aren't terms in there that bind you for a longer period of time than you think or are expensive to get out. Credit card machines, if you're using those, what are the terms of those credit card machines? If you don't like what they're charging you and you didn't understand the fees and they're more exorbitant, what does it cost you to get out of that credit card machine? Things like that.
And employment relationships, something that someone could handle on their own?
It depends what the relationship is. If you are hiring someone to come in and be a trainer in your gym, but they really control their own times and charges and fees, and they're really a 1099 if you're collecting the money for them, that should be spelled out so that there's no question that they're not your employee and there's no workers' compensation exposure. But if you're just hiring someone to work for you and they are your employee and you know what you're going to pay them, and it's at-will employee and there's no papers being signed that they're going to have an employment contract or anything like that, you can probably do that on your own.
And so on the other side of that, if you happen to be the one who says, I'm starting a business, I'm going to be part of that gig economy doing individual contracts with as many people as I can possibly service, do they need contracts too to protect themselves, such as the nature of the relationship they have with the person who's going to be paying them?
Yeah, you'd want to at least have something in writing that establishes the parameters of what's expected of you, what you're going to be compensated for doing, and how much you're going to make, and that type of thing. So I would, in that situation, want from both sides to have that in writing.
So this last quick question is really a topic in itself, and it has everything to do with protection of your intellectual property. So many people are working online these days and doing websites. Do they need specific protection to copyright what materials they have created when they've put it on their website?
Yeah, they do. And you should probably consult with an intellectual law attorney, because that's a specialized area. And there are certain things that you definitely can trademark or copyright, depending on what it is, and you'd want to know that and make sure that whatever protections you can get, you make sure you obtain those.
Because quite a few creatives, as it were, that collective now, photographers, artists, people who are building websites have not done that, and already there's been signs that has become a problem for them.
Yeah, and it definitely will be if you don't take the time to protect yourself.
We hope that this has been helpful to you if you are deciding to start a business. We ask that you stay tuned to Law Matters, as we say. It matters to you. Thank you for tuning in.